Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. History is often told through sweeping narratives of war, politics, and grand movements. But sometimes the most powerful stories come in the form of small, defiant acts, whispers of resistance that dared to challenge the forces of oppression. In his book Postcards to Hitler, A German Jew's Defiance in Time of Terror, Bruce Neuburger tells the story of his grandfather, a man who found himself trapped in Nazi Germany as the world closed its doors to Jewish refugees. Facing an increasingly totalitarian state that sought to erase his existence, he did something radical in its simplicity. He wrote. He wrote anonymous postcards condemning Hitler, denouncing the atrocities he saw unfolding, and warning of the horrors to come. It was an act that was both seemingly small and enormously dangerous. This book is not just a historical account, it is a deeply personal exploration of courage, resistance, and the moral choices people face in times of political darkness. While our conversation today doesn't focus on the book itself, the themes of creeping authoritarianism, the silencing of dissent, and the tactics of division are central to both the book and our present moment. Bruce and I discuss the warning signs he sees today, the strategies used to manipulate public perception, the ways in which societies sleepwalk into authoritarianism, and most importantly, what we can do to resist. If history teaches us anything, it's that the question is never if people will resist, but how many will, and whether they will act before it's too late. Please listen. Bruce Neuburger, thank you so much for making time for our show.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure.
So your book, Postcards to Hitler, as listeners heard in the opening, talks about your family's resistance to the Nazis. We're seeing a rise in authoritarianism and political extremism today around the world, but also in the U.S. with a lot going on here. So what echoes of the past do you see in the present moment? Are there particular warning signs that remind you of what your grandparents faced?
Absolutely. To go back to Germany a little bit, from what I understand, from my reading and from the experiences through my family's stories and so on. When Hitler came to power, they had a saying, a slogan that they used a great deal, which was called Gleichschaltung, which meant coordination, what the Nazis were doing when they were able to take control of power was to try to seize control of all the various sources of information and control and organization to project a common message. And in so doing, try to shut down the part of the population that didn't agree with them and get Germany marching in step behind their program. And if you look at what's going on now with Trump and them, the things that they've called shock and awe, flood the zone, muzzle velocity, all this, these are efforts to shock the population into sort of like almost being silent and paralyzed, so that they can begin to reshape society according to their program, which I would say is more like a white national, Christian nationalist and white supremacist and ultra nationalist program. It has a lot of similarities to what the Nazis were trying to do. Nazis, use extreme forms of nationalism as sort of their ideology to unite the German people behind their program. And the other side of this is the what I call diversion and division, which is you divert people away from the real sources of the problems in society. You divert it on to people who actually have nothing to do with that. And you divide people and create conflicts among different sections of the population. So in Germany, Most prominently, it was the Jews that were being targeted as the guilty parties for all the various problems that German people were suffering. And so you divert people away from the real sources of the problems. I mean, there's a history to that, which I don't know if much you want to go into it in Germany, but there's a history to it too here. I mean, we are a society that has been riven by racial divisions for centuries now, and these are being refurbished in this era and used, weaponized is the modern term, right? Weaponized to for a political end, for a program that the Trump and the MAGA fascists, is what I call them, are trying to impose on us. So
So, one thing, and you can kind of tell me from your research whether this aligns, is, it seems like there's a sleepwalking into these things a little bit, right? I mean, there's a degree to which these regimes kind of just keep moving the Overton window so that more radical things start to seem more and more normal, and if in 1932 you said this is where it ends, this is what it looks like in 1943 or something like that, it seems like most of the Germans would have said, no, I don't want that. But it all started to be acceptable in these chunks as they moved along, and I see parallels there as well. Would you say that aligns with what your research?
absolutely true. Absolutely true. Yeah, they try to get you used to the next outrage, and then the next outrage just becomes the norm. The norm. There's the book I was just reading in preparing for this discussion here. It's called Defying Hitler by Sebastian Hafner, and he talks about, for example, most of the Germans in 1933 were not supporters of Hitler by any means. He didn't win anywhere near a majority. And so, by the summer of 1933, he's asking the question, what happened to the opposition? What happened to them? And what did happen to them is that they became kind of overwhelmed by by the the program that the attacks, the violence, the threats, and so on, and they got paralyzed. They literally became paralyzed, or they sort of withdrew into themselves. They sought little, escape from what they couldn't confront individually. And so, um, I guess I'm really answering a different question here, but the point I think is that in facing in terms of what you were just saying about the creeping um, reactionary kind of programs, the policies that become more and more ugly, and people have a different reactions to those. Some of them, sometimes people just withdraw into it and hope against hope that it's not going to get worse, or find like individual ways of escaping it. Um, and then the things continue like that. But I think the if you want to put a lesson into it, what you have to do is you have to confront it. You have to face up to it. You have to realize what's going on around you, right? That the water's getting warmer. It's eventually going to boil. You have to understand that, and then you have to react to it and not try to adjust to it and not try to escape from it. And I think anyway,
Well, in your family's case, so when did they take up resistance, and kind of what were some of those indicators that said it's time to do that? And so how did that work for them in practice?
okay, so in practice is from what I can understand from my research and my discussions with family, is that my family was a middle class Jewish family in Munich, okay, and they had come from within their lifetimes, they had come from being really relatively impoverished uh, small town dwellers to becoming middle class city dwellers, doing relatively well. Okay. And that was not unusual for a certain section of the German population, and in particular among Jews, because Jews had migrated from the small towns where their lives were very restricted, extremely. They were very few jobs, in fact, that they could become engaged in. And they were always marked as Jews because in their small towns, everybody knew everybody else. So they go to the big city, they had a lot more freedom. They felt a lot freer and they had a lot more perspectives on life. So that sort of made them feel much more like Germans, made them feel like they were part of Germany. And then when World War I came around, they were very, not universally, but many German Jews were very enthusiastic about the war, including my grandparents and my grandfather. So they were very German, and then of course Germany loses the war, and then things start going in a different direction. But I think that my grandfather in particular and my grandmother, to some degree, my father as well, having grown up in Munich and been very integrated with non-Jewish people. In fact, he knew very few Jews. He was an athlete, and his friends were all non-Jews. They all felt very German, and they didn't believe that Germany would ever turn on them to the way it ended up turning on them. And then the other factor I would say is that there had always been had been episodes of anti-Jewish kind of spasms, you might call them. So they looked at it as, well, okay, this is another one. We'll write it out, and we'll have to endure. It's not pleasant, but I think that carried them up until, frankly, Kristallnacht, which people might remember. In November of 1938, there was a big riot, pogrom, they call it, against Jews, with the burning of the synagogues and the destruction of stores and invasion of homes. And my grandfather was dragged off to Dachau, the first concentration camp that opened up in Germany back in 33. Anyway, he was hauled off in 1938. At that point, people realized that things had gone to an extent that they hadn't imagined it could go. And at that point, there was a desperate effort to try to get out. Before that, my grandfather was more like, no, we'll ride this out. Like I said, he had something to protect. He had some properties and this sort of thing. My father didn't get out until 1938, which is relatively late. And he didn't get out because he was a traveling salesman. He was doing okay. They weren't wealthy. They had lost most of their wealth during the time of the inflation and post-war World War I era. But he was doing okay, and he felt comfortable in Germany, but gradually became less and less comfortable. And I guess there's another point here that I think is important and kind of relates to the question you previously asked. He was a traveling salesman. He traveled all Germany, and he knew German people all over. I'm talking about he was going to Stuttgart and Berlin, and he was going to Frankfurt and Leipzig, and so he had a lot of contact with Germans in the entire country, and he was doing well and he was comfortable. But after 1933, things started to change. Attitudes starting to change. People who had been friendly to them started becoming, less friendly. People who had a very open attitude towards, diversity, for example, right? Different kinds of people, different backgrounds, all of a sudden, or gradually became more and more conservative in their views, more restrictive in their views. So he began to feel that the atmosphere was becoming more and more uncomfortable. And it wasn't until I think 1937 that he sort of decided he wanted to leave. And then there was another issue. It was called Aryanization. Aryanization was basically when companies, businesses, Jewish-owned businesses were turned over to a non-Jewish person, an Aryan, so-called Aryan. And he realized that the business that he'd worked for since he was like 17, he was now almost 30, it was going to be taken over by a non-Jewish company. So at that point, he realized he wasn't going to have any place to work. He wasn't going to have a possibility of livelihood. That sort of pushed him in that direction. So yeah, it was a gradual thing for a lot of Jews. I think maybe some more foresighted Jews decided wanted to get out right away. Some left earlier. My mother came from a small town called Breidenbach because in those small towns you couldn't really get away from the Nazis. They knew who you were and so on. Even if it was just like five of them in a town, they could make your life miserable. In the big city, you could walk around and nobody knew you were Jewish. So anyway, in terms of resistance, the question of resistance didn't really, my grandfather didn't take up resistance as far as I mean, there are all kinds of forms of resistance, of course, right? Subtle and individual and private and so on. But in terms of active resistance of a public nature, he didn't do that until 1941. And he started resisting in 1941 on September 20, 1941, which is a very significant moment for Jews in Germany, because it was the day that you had to start wearing the yellow star. And I guess you could say for him that was the final straw. He was just not going to go there, and he wasn't going to commit suicide. He decided he was going to do something, and so he started putting postcards anonymously in the mail, denouncing Hitler and denouncing what he saw as the coming Holocaust. And he didn't come to that conclusion until January of 1942. So he decided to take up resistance, in the fall of 1941.
And he was inside Germany at that point?
He was still living in Munich. He was the thing what that happened is that after Kristallnacht, a lot of Jews who had previously, like my grandfather, thought, well, we'll just ride this out, realized that that wasn't going to work and tried to get out. And they were going to the U.S. consulates and the consulates of other countries and trying to, get their visas and get their papers in order. And basically, the world shut their doors on them, including the United States. So it became almost impossible to get a visa. And even though by that time, my aunt, my father's sister, and my father were in the United States. I'm talking about in 1938, and they were getting the necessary documents together. They called it the affidavit, which guaranteed that an affidavit basically said, I will make sure that this person who comes here will not be a ward of the state. I'll make sure that they will have a place to stay. They'll have some sustenance. I can get them a job, whatever it is. And you had to have that to immigrate at that point to the United States. But you also needed a visa. And unbeknownst to most German Jews, there was a concerted effort on the part of the U.S. State Department to keep Jews from immigrating. And so they became extremely frustrated trying to get their visas. And they just couldn't understand why the process was so convoluted and bureaucratic and so on. And they didn't know that, in fact, there had been a memo written by the Assistant Secretary of State for Immigration, Breckinridge Long, basically telling the consulates in Germany, do whatever you can to keep these people from coming over.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that was.
So, we often hear that institutions like the courts, the media, the rule of law, and they'll protect democracy. I mean, Germany had a constitution and was a republic when all this started. And history tells us that these institutions don't always hold. So, did Germans think the same thing? I mean, that changed pretty fast, so maybe they didn't think it for very long. But since we know these institutions don't always hold, what in addition to like the idea of what were Germans thinking about that, and also how can everyday people play a role in resisting this authoritarianism before it takes hold?
Well, that's an incredibly good question. Well, first of all, I think one of the things that the Nazis did when they first took power, I think it was even in maybe February of 1933, around that time, even before the Reichstag fire, is they started invading, they started going into institutions where, like the court, there's a famous court in Berlin, I don't recall the name exactly, but they went in and what they did was they expelled the Jewish judges like that. And then they went into the universities and so on. I mean, the attacks on Jews was a very strategic thing for the Nazis, okay? Because it gave them it gave them a way of driving a wedge between people and creating terror, even if you were yourself not the target of the terror. Maybe it was your Jewish neighbor, but the moment you decided you were going to separate yourself from them, you had already started along the path down the path to perdition, you might say. You've already caved in, maybe morally, and then you start feeling bad about yourself. Okay, so that's one thing I think that Martin Niemöller, the pastor Niemöller, people may have heard of him. He had that famous poem, first they came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, and then they came for the trade unionists, and so on and so on. I mean, that was what he summed up from that experience. You have got to stop. You have got to take a stand in the very beginning. You don't wait. You don't say, well, they're just taking so and so. I mean, and I'm not Jewish or I'm not an immigrant. I'm, whatever. I'm not trans. I'm okay. Um, they won't come after me. But when you start making those concessions, ideologically, politically, morally, you are already giving ground to the very thing that could eventually eat you up as well. And so, in terms of how do we look at this, you try to oppose the first manifestations, and of course, it's not that easy individually. You have to seek out others. You have to seek out others, and you have to start talking about this stuff. And you have to not allow yourself to become fearful and paranoid and cowed into submission. It's extremely important that you realize that you do have the potential strength as a group to resist. They're going to tell you no, you don't. They're going to tell you you're weak and all that. They're going to flood the zone. Isn't that what Steve Bannon said? They're going to flood the zone, so you're going to think you're overwhelmed. And what can we do? And you've got to fight that feeling because. And I was just doing a little bit of mathematical work here. 77 million people voted for Trump. 170 million people didn't vote for him. I'm talking about the voting age population in the United States. Okay. So it's not like he has this overwhelming mandate, and it's not like there aren't plenty of people out there that are opposed to what his program, his white supremacy, his attacks on immigrants and the rest, attacks on gays and lesbians and all that business, trans people and so on. You know, there are plenty of people out there, and you've got to and there's a great potential, I think, for people to resist and to actually create a positive wave, that could actually be favorable for anyway, stuff like that. So in Germany, that didn't happen. It didn't happen in Germany. People became cowed and silenced. And I think this is another positive factor for us. We have that experience. They didn't. The Germans didn't have an experience of facing fascism. It hadn't. I mean, it happened in Italy, but I think that experience in Italy had really been absorbed by the German people. They hadn't really taken it into account. But we do have that experience. We do know how that works, and so I think that that's a positive factor for us. And I mean, I think we have a lot of positive factors here as well, besides that.
Well, and along those lines, earlier talked about the MAGA fascists. I mean, we should probably clarify based on what you just said. You're not really talking about your next door neighbor who voted for Trump. You're talking about the people in power. Would that be a fair way to characterize it?
I would say that, but I would also say, and I think, unfortunately, this is true, that is a certain base of people that have been won to a certain point of view and very strenuously. I'm not saying that they can't be won over to a different point of view, but at this point, they've been won over to a certain point of view, and I would call it a very narrow point of view. That there's just a certain kind of human being that really has value, and there's others that don't.
Well, I
Um,
want to I want to be careful here because now
yeah.
we're saying people should be divided between MAGA and not MAGA. You were saying before that we're all part of the
I'm
same,
no, I'm
and
no, I'm
and
not.
we're in this together.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that there are certain, yeah, they are dividing us. They are. There are divisions based on ideology, but I'm just saying that as a species, as human beings, we are all our destiny. Unfortunately, that's not the way a lot of the folks that are, I mean, look, the leadership, the Trump and the people around him, the Republicans, the Republican Party, and so on, they have a certain program, and I think it has to do with a lot of it's self-interest, some of it has to do with sort of imperial interests of this country, and they have won people over to that program. I mean, in Germany, they won a section. The Nazis would not have been able to come to power if did not have a base of support. That doesn't mean that the folks that came to were fanatical for Hitler, uh, who tended to be very anti-Semitic and very nationalistic. There's not to say that they couldn't have been won over to another point of view, but there are different points of view. It's not something basic to their being. It's not their genetics. It's not their essence in any way in terms of view, but there are points of view. I mean, these are just realities. I mean, and and they if Trump didn't have a certain section of people that were uniting around his point of view and the way he looks at things, he wouldn't be able to come to power and be able to do the things that he's doing. I don't think that that's dividing people. I think that's opposing an ideology which divides people. So I mean, yeah.
So let's wrap up with what is. I know you've talked about this a little bit already, but what is either one thing or some things that an average person can do today to push back against, maybe preventing history from repeating itself?
Well, I think, first and foremost, people need to, I think, recognize that this divide and rule politics is not healthy for us. It's not healthy for society. It's not healthy for humanity. Um, and in terms of what people can actually do, I think there are lots and lots of things people can do. I mean, you could, first of all, just talk to your friends, talk to your relatives. I know a lot of times these become difficult conversations. Um, but seek out ways not to attack the person as a person, but to respect respect people for their point of view. Give people a break. I mean, even if their point of view is something that's abhorrent to you, give them the respect to say, yeah, okay, I hear what you're saying. I just have to say that I don't agree. Not to attack the person as a person, but to try to elevate conversations to a point of view of, these are ideas. These are different ideas in society that have impact on the what happens. And so that's one thing. I mean, on a very, very basic level, treat other people with respect as people, but also if you don't agree with them, there's no reason to pretend you do. I mean, these are difficult things. I mean, all of us, I think, to one degree or another, wrestle with this. I even within my own family, there are things that happen. And there are times when you just don't raise differences just because you don't want to break relations that are important, and you're just going to have to bypass. It's more poetry than it is mechanics. You know what I mean? It's like more subtle than just play by the rules. So I mean, all of us, as we deal with other human beings, become pretty good at it, I think, if we try. And we know that there's a lot of subtlety to it. So, but I think the other thing is don't abandon your principles, especially the principles of equality and justice for all human beings and respect for human beings, whatever culture, whatever background, whatever gender, whatever race, and so on, so-called race, and so on. But I also, on another level, I think people should get active. I mean, it's a little bit easier for me. I'm in San Francisco. There's a lot of activists in San Francisco. I live in a community where you can't get away from immigrants. They're everywhere. We're in a sea of immigrants and different diversity. I know diversity is becoming a dirty word now, but I love the diversity myself. I walk down the streets of my district in San Francisco, and I love it. Asians and Latinos and South Asians and African Americans and so on. And so yeah, but when you see immigrants being attacked, I mean, I don't know, find a way to oppose it. Go to a demonstration. So anyway, what I'm trying to say here is that we've got to defend the media. We've got to defend all the sources of information that are being, they're going to attempt to suppress. We've got to inform ourselves as much as we can about history, the history of this country, which is, as you know, like in Florida, they have outlawed certain books. This is one thing, as librarians are one of the great defenders of our democratic, order, because they're fierce defenders of the right to libraries to carry certain books. So go to a library and check out that book. I don't know. If you have the means, buy a book from one of the books that's being banned. Inform yourself as much as you can. Promote popular media that tells the truth when you can. Of course, truth is something that is itself controversial. But I guess inform yourself as much as you can, about the world, and stay active, and don't keep quiet, and speak up when you see something that's wrong. Yeah, that's what I would say, David.
That's great. Well, Bruce Neuburger, thank you so much for making time for our show. And the book is Postcards to Hitler.
Yeah, Postcards to Hitler, German Jews' Defiance in a Time of Terror. And it's available if people want to get a copy of it. It's available wherever books or audiobooks are available. Good luck on all your programming and so on. Okay, I'll keep an eye out for it. I'll keep an eye out for it now.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.